Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I think we will start. I know that the schedule is a bit jumbled and lots of people are trying to get here between different events, so some people will join us as we go and the sound will catch up with us. For those of you wondering whether you're in the right room, if you're here to discuss Africa's just energy future and why we need a roadmap to rapidly unlock investment for the continent, then you're in the right place. And even if that's not what you were planning to attend, you're still in the right place, because that is the most important conversation for us to have today. We are joined here by a number of esteemed personalities, most notably the Prime Ministers of Burundi and Mozambique next to me, and we will have the opportunity to hear from both of them at different points in the conversation today. We welcome them both to the conversation, and I'll call upon them later. And we will also have the opportunity to hear from a number of experts and perspectives on the question of attracting investment into energy in Africa. Really, to kick us off in that journey and in terms of understanding the question at hand, I will introduce Prime Minister Adriano Maliane, Prime Minister of Mozambique, to give us a sense of how sitting in his country, which has a very critical positioning in energy, but also a great need in terms of energy poverty, to share a perspective on how he views this question of energy investment onto the continent. Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Moderator. I think that to go straight forward, I have to read. I was not supposed to read, but I think that is better to make sure that I pass the message. So, once again, good afternoon. I'm here to share some experience what we have in Mozambique, and of course to make sure that the transition period we can share what we can do in that perspective. There's no doubt that the energy issue have become a top priority, not only in developing countries and on the African continent, but around the world. Africa is a continent with proven diverse and abundant natural resources: coal, oil, gas, geothermal, biomass, hydro, solar, and wind. Proper use of natural energy resource should benefit the region to accelerate intensive energy use, industrialization, and electrification for the benefit of the community. In this regard, Mozambique is implementing program Energy for All in 2020 and 2030, using available natural energy source in the continent, including renewable one. Regional coordination of resource and infrastructure for investment in the energy sector is an imperative option to strengthen African vision. It is critical to identify priorities, interventions, and align integration with the long-term goals of country in the region. Energy must be treated as the main economic driver for the countries in the region, on which their competitiveness and access for their products to global markets depend. With its huge and diverse renewable energy resource, among others solar, hydro, wind, and biomass, Mozambique can be the energy hub for Southern Africa. Natural gas and LNG have a more critical role in response to the pressing needs for energy diversification and resilience to the current volatile environment. It is our understanding that natural gas presents an opportunity to the energy transition, and Mozambique can play an important role in that regard. At the region level, and based on its unique hydro resource, Mozambique is positioning itself to become a renewable energy hub, which can make important contribution to Southern Africa energy transition and promote green industrialization to produce low carbon commodities. To realize these ambitions, our government is already putting climate at the heart of our work by establishing a climate finance unity at the Ministry of Economy and Finance to shape a coordinated approach towards the mobilization of climate and transition resources. Ladies and gentlemen, the global finance architecture to support sector-wide transition will also require urgent scale-up and reforms. It is in this context I would like to highlight 2 points. One, we call upon countries to accelerate the operationalization of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and put in place robust system for low carbon projects, particularly in vulnerable developing countries, to benefit from international carbon markets. 2, we welcome the recent initiative from IMF to set up resilience and sustainability facilities, which will provide long-term concessional financing to support transition towards more climate-resilient economies. We believe that with the partner support, African countries, including Mozambique, can make important contribution to the global green transition in the energy sector. Concluding, we reemphasize our commitment to continue exploring our resources in a sustainable manner to ensure economic growth, job creation, poverty reductions, and achieving the sustainable development goals. These are some ideas that I have to share with you, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister, for laying out the perspective of a country like Mozambique faced with the challenge of achieving inclusive development and making the most of its available resources in the context of also addressing energy poverty. It was pointed out that I forgot to actually say who was speaking. So my name is James Mwangi. I'm the founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa and Chief Executive of Africa Climate Ventures. As you can tell from the names of the organizations I'm involved with, the question of investing in Africa's energy future is fairly central to what I care about and what I think all of us care about. Building on that perspective from a country trying to drive towards economic transformation, I'd like to invite our next panelist, and that will be Begumuzi Dinbebe of PowerShift Africa, a fantastic name, to talk about why it's important that the nature of energy investments in Africa shift, both in quantum and nature, from your perspective. Over to you, Begumuzi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It is very important as we understand the idea around locking and unlocking our energy pathways in Africa that we pay attention to the challenges that exist in terms of what's stopping Africa from leapfrogging towards renewable energy. There's the question of information, technological development within the continent, even also skilled capacity. But one major challenge that I want to highlight itself is the recent dash for gas in Africa, which instead has provided an avenue where we've seen a significant amount being funneled in advance for fossil fuel-funded projects across the continent in comparison to renewable energy. And that, to a large extent, provides us with a problem and a huge challenge in terms of unlocking that said investment in order to deliver the said promise for Africa's development. We cannot arrive at a moment in time now where we want to then affirm that, a historical regime that has been grounded on oil, gas, and coal will deliver development in Africa, because historically, as we speak, we've got 600 million Africans without energy access. In countries that have gas at the current moment, the population over 70% still currently lack electricity. So at the end of the day, we cannot rely on outdated models for us to try and achieve the said development that has been misinformed by the view how we want to understand gas as a transition fuel. Now, what this summit is going to provide for us is to set the record straight and set the stage for success at upcoming events, at the Africa Climate Summit, at the UN Climate Ambition Summit, and even at COP28. Because as a new model of clean energy provisions comes into focus, we see a dash for old vested interests that are reasserting themselves, being perpetuated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously. And we see a scenario where we've seen redoubling efforts to extract and exploit fossil fuels from Africa. And this dash for gas has inevitably put lives at risk in Africa while trapping the continent in a deadly cycle of energy poverty, climate pollution, and colonialism. So essentially, investments currently into fossil gas risks undermining Africa's development. And currently, the continent itself is not trying to manage emissions. We're trying to actually pull ourselves away from emissions. And essentially then, because of that, the dash for gas, we're now really saddling, with debt for export-oriented gas production, for which there will be fewer and fewer customers as demand drops, thus leaving African people on the hook to cover the cost of these stranded assets. And this is despite the reality that these countries are currently owed a climate debt. So we need to really change the course away from this dangerous fossil fueled pathway, especially with such expansion carrying technological, economic, and social risks and uncertainties for Africa's right to develop, because that right is essentially real and fundamental. But it must not be used to justify the measures that, in fact, threaten to lock Africa's economies in a cycle of need and want. Rather, it is critical for Africa to cultivate increased investments in its abundant renewable energy wealth to accelerate worthwhile and equitable development across the continent. Now, this new global finance architecture has a sacred responsibility to usher favorable climate finance policies in Africa to end energy poverty on the continent in a manner that stimulates sustainable and equitable development while making contributions to fight against the climate crisis. And the report that I have with me now provides us with that said blueprint on how we can achieve the just transition in Africa. Essentially, African countries and as a whole, we should continue to unite to push essentially through this report the scaling up of finance through existing mechanisms such as the multilateral climate funds. We need to begin initiating new measures such as the global programs to support renewable energy development. We need to deploy innovative financial sources such as financial transaction taxes, redirection of subsidies, and special drawing rights. And most importantly, the systematic cancellation of unfair and odious debts across the continent. We need to improve regulation of transnational corporations and tax evasions. We need to reform of imbalanced and unfair international rules on trade, investment, and technology. Because, for example, ideas around the structural adjustment programs were actually deliberated in the 1940s. There was no African country that was independent in that time. So why are we still using that same model to advance the same economic thinking and activity in the hopes of achieving development for the continent, particularly grounding it on renewable energy? Through this report, we suggest that we need to reform the international financial architecture, drawing on the historical processes, such as the new international economic order and the new ones, such as the Bridgetown Initiative. And lastly, we need to also think around the reparations for the colonial atrocities, biopiracy, and the appropriation of cultural heritage if Africa is to truly develop and unlock a pathway that would really open up funding funds for renewable energy. Right. Thank you.
So a number of very powerful levers that potentially could be pulled there. And really this point around, is there a risk? Is there a lock-in risk with a fossil fuel pathway? And potentially an overlooked opportunity around renewables. And I'll pick up on that idea of renewables in the particular moment of opportunity here, because it seems like a very natural segue to you, Rebecca. Rebecca Shirley, at the World Resources, you've done a lot of work around the sheer scale of the African natural resource opportunity. And it would be useful to understand why is now a particular moment to act.
Thank you. Thanks, James, for that. And good morning / good afternoon. I think we've just crossed the afternoon border to everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Merci beaucoup
It's a fantastic
de nous
question.
rejoindre.
I'm going to start from the point of view
Je vais commencer du point de vue des renouvelables et de l'économie verte et de l'industrialisation écologique. Parce qu'on pourrait beaucoup parler des opportunités qu'il y a en Afrique, mais très franchement, l'ère de l'avantage concurrentiel est passé. Nous avons besoin d'actions stratégiques. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Nous allons vers un futur où c'est l'électricité qui sera la grosse consommation d'énergie. Et nous devons utiliser l'électricité avec des processus qui utilisent l'hydrogène ou des produits dérivés de l'hydrogène. Pour l'Afrique, nous avons 90% plus. But in order to, but the costs of that renewable energy are coming down very quickly. The efficiency is increasing very quickly. So that means that shortly, even in places where it's less ideal to produce renewables and to leverage renewable energy, it will be possible. That's the same for hydrogen. The costs of hydrogen production are coming down and are likely to come down, according to the latest analysis, quite quickly. So then, where your offer is to provide energy services and vectors to regions where it's less viable, you have to act quick before they are also able to do it, right? And so this means that as the costs of technology and production are declining, we have to look at the cost of transportation. And the cost of transportation is not declining so quickly. So what the latest analyses suggest is that there is limited prospect for interregional trade of energy products and energy technology. So we have to really leverage the opportunity now. And if Africa wants to influence the location, the locality of international green manufacturing, international green industry, especially in hydrogen-intensive industries like steel, the time to act is now. I know we're short for time, but I can't leave out the nature economy, which is also important. And there's an urgency there as well, because we're talking about restoration. We're talking about agriculture and circular food economy. We're talking about not nature-based carbon sinks. And you know, on the continent right now, there are 700 million hectares of land that could be leveraged for restoration, meaning they're sitting on the bench when we need them on the court now more than ever. But to leverage those resources, what we need is partly the carbon opportunity, right? So that we spur the markets. And then once we've done that and we're restoring lands, then we're creating more arable land, we're creating more productive land, and we're improving soils. And we know that from a population point of view, from an urbanization point of view, that is an urgent need for the continent. So there's a circularity there there's an entry point that we need to enter into now in order to sort of create these virtuous cycles. So I know we're short on time, but just to say that the opportunity is there, absolutely. But strategic public policy intervention is needed really urgently to leverage those opportunities, and it's going to be a team effort. Governments, along with investors and the investor community locally and internationally, along with technical service providers like ourselves, we need to work together fast to leverage these opportunities.
I really appreciate that call for speed, because there's both a large opportunity but a need for nimbleness and precision. You need to be knowing what you're going after and why you're going after it and how that competitive environment is changing, which is really powerful. It also tied in well to the Prime Minister's points around Mozambique thinking not just about its energy assets, but about Article 6 and carbon markets and the opportunity for Mozambique, given its natural bounty and potential, to be a player in carbon. So again, there's a lot of practical things here, but that desire and need for us to move quickly and practically. And practically is why I'll come to you next, Charles Wahongo of Enzi Jayo. I speak Kiswahili, so I know you're in the next era, is what your organization stands for. And you're actually out there asking what needs to change at the level of policy and implementation to really drive this new energy future for actual benefit of the people on the ground. Charles, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, I've been tasked a bit to speak around the geopolitics of financing, and I think a good point to start first is by saying there's an African saying that when a hyena wants to eat its own, it accuses them of smelling like goats. And so what's happening at the moment is that Africa is seen as a high-risk, high-reward area. That's a label that you're given. And so as soon as you're given that high-risk label, then how financing manifests itself is one of the challenges. And so it manifests itself in terms of the need for government guarantees, the need for foreign-denominated contracts, and also high interest rates, right? And so the challenge there is that when we speak of bankable projects, if you're in France or in Europe, then a 4%, a 3% even is something that a lot of people are willing to take. But when you look at Nairobi, if you're sitting in Nairobi looking at a Nairobi project or a project in Lagos, then the interest rate factor that's being looked there is much higher, right? And so now that has an impact in terms of even in the end in terms of the financing and thing. And so the one thing that we need to really look at and see how to change that mindset of high risk is for Africa to stop smelling like goats. And so in terms of a roadmap from there, I mean, in terms of what we see as critical, it's sort of that innovative financing that needs to be put towards the challenge. And so the first thing is around the current state of indebtedness of a lot of the countries. And so we need to find ways to relieve some of that debt so that you can even have a bit of that space to guarantee the financing for the projects that we are asking to go in. A second key thing is we speak constantly that a lot of countries are already sort of renewable on the continent. But we're having one of the impacts of the climate crisis is on our hydropower, right? So a country like Kenya, which is already majority renewable, I mean, we're going through a drought at the moment, and we're having to now go back to our thermal plants to basically plug that gap. And so, again, we need to look at innovative ways of financing even the existing independent power producers to be able to bring on that spare capacity to address the ongoing climate crisis and the droughts that are there that are considering increasing the cost of financing and the cost of power. And lastly, I mean, and the last 2 points that I just really need to think about, if we're talking about energy access, then we have to think about financing and financing in local currency, right? And that's one of the other challenges of being considered high risk, that we are only thinking of foreign denominated financing. We need to look at that local financing to enable that the cost to actually be that, to make it accessible and affordable to the majority of the populations. Because again, the need that's there, especially around unemployment of the youth and sort of to increase industrialization, we need to look at more innovative ways of financing that infrastructure that exists to enable our future generations, as my organization says, to be able to live a better future. Thank you.
Thank you. And some interesting tie-ins between some of the levers you've talked about, some of what is being discussed elsewhere during this summit, some of the points, Bekumuzi, you made about really addressing the cost of capital. But speaking of that goat-like smell and how we engage investors in the right way, Hubert, you spend a lot of time talking about Africa with investors, to investors, for investors. What is your lens on the Africa story around this energy shift for the investor class globally?
No, thank you very much, James. And it's really great to have the Prime Minister here, because I almost believe that we're just looking in the wrong direction completely. We're relying on a $1.5 trillion collective balance sheet of multilateral development banks to solve a $30 trillion problem. The underlying issue is called private capital mobilization. So we're here with all of the institutions that have never been able to mobilize capital in line with their own criteria. For every $1 of MDB finance, they're supposed to be able to mobilize $10 of private capital. What is the result? According to the G20, for every $1 of MDB finance that they provide, they mobilize 20 cents. So we're all here believing that the same institutions' collective $1.5 trillion balance sheet can help us. This whole agenda is actually an investment agenda. But because it's been characterized by MDBs and it's a financial architecture, so we're all actually looking in the wrong direction, if the truth be known. And we've been categorized and positioned as the African continent to be at the lower part of that chain. So the first thing I would say before we start talking about all these different instruments and all these different new ideas is we need to understand that we need climate investment statesmanship. Our leaders should not be sort of just talking to the 1.5 trillion collective balance sheet. We should be talking to the 150 trillion to the 200 trillion pool of institutional capital that cannot sort of articulate how the gap is growing and who's responsible for it, but have the capital to be able to close that gap. So I think that's the first thing. We have to change our mindset and address and engage the $150 trillion pool of capital. It's called investment. It's institutional pool of capital. And we're obsessing with this finance issue, and it can't work. And we're actually getting crowded out. So the real elephant in the room, that sort of $1 to 20 cents, is actually competing with the investment that we all say that we need. So until we can fundamentally own up and be honest politicians, honest business leaders, honest civil society representatives, until we can shift this conversation to one of investment, medium to long-term investment, I do believe we're deluding ourselves completely, and we're cheating our people, and we're cheating the world in terms of the aspirations that we think we can actually accomplish through utilizing Africa's competitive bounty of human capital, natural capital, clean and green tech mineral endowment that's oversized. But I think the question is, we can all highlight the problem. The bottom line is we need a wholesale investment plan. We can't sit down. I think my colleague gave a very good African example there. The one I will give is when elephants fight, it's the ground that suffers. Now, capital is global. This $150 to $200 trillion pool of capital is global. It needs a wholesale investment plan and strategy to be attracted. Now, in Europe, we have the EU Green Industrialization Plan. In the US, we have the Inflation Reduction Act. Those two, whether they sit alongside each other or whether they compete, Africa is suffering because the global institutional pools of capital have a real concrete investment plan to be able to respond to. So I think the very first thing that we actually need to do as a continent is not sort of keep talking in this little pond of development finance, but we need to jump into the pool of institutional capital and the entry ticket to that game. The pathway to that opportunity is through having a defined investment plan that talks to our institutional investability and how we can enfranchise the private sector and how we can create and operate assets and unlock our underlying potential and endowments that will not only decarbonize the continent, but also decarbonize the world. And there's one point I think that my other colleague, Dean, mentioned, data. Data is so important to be able to take informed investment decisions. Now, a lot of that data sits in the Global Emerging Markets database, the GEMS database. And one of the pieces that we've put out basically show that the MDBs that control the GEMS database, who for 10 years have refused to democratize access to investors and credit rating agencies, just in excess interest payments, we're paying $15.6 billion a year extra. That doesn't even take account of lost opportunities. So before we start talking about new instruments and new opportunities, I think we need to understand that NDBs are crowding out the private sector. We need climate investment statesmanship. We need our heads of state to have a new financial investment pact summit with $150 to $200 trillion pool of capital, in addition to a new financial pact summit that brings $1.5 trillion together. And I think that this is where we as a collective, your good organization, World Resources Institute, Mo Ibrahim Foundation and others, that have recognized the importance of putting this plan together. We can't go with development applications. We have $3 trillion worth of nationally determined contribution projects that need investment between now and 2030. That is more investment that needs to be mobilized now in the next 7 years than the entire world mobilized for renewable energies in the last 7 years. We only got 2.8%. So I think just to understand, as we design our nationally determined contribution projects, they are now being described as MDBDCs, not NDCs. They're being described as multilateral development bank determined contributions, which ultimately end up not being bankable, because all of the thought that goes into designing those proposals is to actually just get the first grant. That's why everyone's complaining now. Why are the NDCs not financeable? Well, they're not financeable because they're designed for finance, not for long-term investment. There's no transition. There's no capacity in government. There's no capacity in anything to actually close that 23 trillion emerging market gap unless we have long-term institutional investor partnerships. So I'll end there. Institutional investor-public partnerships, James. Until we can start thinking about that, we're going to be looking in the wrong direction, playing with instruments of the past, and working with a competitor that hasn't been told your mandate needs to change. We need to partner on institutional investor-public partnerships for our industrialization. Thank you.
So really centering, I think one of the things you've usefully done, Hubert, is really center us in actual global private capital as what it's going to take. The scale of what we need to do has to involve driving the private capital markets to look at Africa and the African opportunity in a different way. And I feel like as the conversation moves forward, I'd be remiss if we're talking about bringing global capital to Africa or investing wisely on the continent to not turn to you, Mo Ibrahim, to offer a little bit of a reflection on this, because you've done that in a previous almost unimaginable transition. The mobile phone transition was when it started unimaginable, and it happened a lot faster than people would think. And you've been investing since then on the continent. You've heard a little bit of the conversation here. How does that land with you in terms of what it'll take to happen? What all of us are saying are the opportunities on the continent.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. And I'll start probably from where my friends ended. Is this working? Yes. Okay. We have a major problem is the cost of capital. And we keep talking about the private sector investing in Africa. And private sector will not invest in Africa. Will not do it. Why? We have the rating agencies stating that all African countries are classified at sub-investable grade. Yeah? That's a problem. That takes huge part of this private money out. Because under Basel rules, if you are a pension fund, you cannot invest in any junk. We are classified as junk. Do you understand that, guys? We are junk. So, by rules, a lot of this private money cannot invest in Africa. Stop. Finished. The rest of the money, private equity, etc., have incredible demand. I sat in an investment committee of a number of funds, and our friends look at a project in Africa and say, oh, I need an IRR of 20% before I invest in Africa. Why? Oh, because it's subgrade, it's junk, it's risky. How can you generate projects which will give you 20% IRR? You guys are dreaming? You cannot do that. So we have a major problem. And this wonderful rating agency have 2 offices in South Africa. There are 54 African countries and pretend they know all about Africa. This is crap. This is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. This risk is totally exaggerated, and it really sinking the whole country. Because if the cost of capital is prohibitive, forget about the private sector. And the money is in the private sector, then forget about development. It doesn't happen. Then how are we going to solve this? First, rating agency need to be sort themselves out to act as a proper, so we need a better governance over there. Secondly, instead of thinking of the development banks, multilaterals, etc., as crowding the private sector, no, we should think of them as tools to enable the private sector. What they need is to de-risk. Is all the development money given to Africa was turned into de-risking money, we will have been better off. Because that will enable all those guys to come and invest in Africa. That is the only way forward, because otherwise it doesn't happen. You mentioned my stuff in Africa, mobile. Do you know I had 0 debt in my company because banks will not lend us. You are an African company. Oh, you're doing telecom? Sorry, they put the phone down. When we sold the company, we returned all the money to the share because we had zero debt. Can you develop a technology company with zero debt? We had to do it with equity all the time, so we have to sell our shares in order to do it, because we have to do it by equity. There's no telephone company in the world developed without debt. We, in Africa, we're the only company developed with zero debt, because we cannot get, we don't have access. And this is the issue. And people need to understand that. Unless we solve this issue, guys, forget it. Switch off the light. It wouldn't happen. That's the most urgent issue. And all our conversation with the World Bank, with IMF, with whoever, is about how we change that situation. We should stop being classified as junk. That's something. Second point I want to make is about the climate, which I'm totally appalled that until now we're unable to agree on this most basic, easy solution to the climate, which is carbon tax. Unless you price carbon, how are we going to move forward? And what I found amazing is the people who invented the market economy, taught us in school about the market economy, are the guys who are turning out their back on market economy when you talk about carbon tax. This is cheap, very cheap, and that's why those people are losing credibility. Total loss of credibility. You want to solve the problem? It's so easy. We have, well, at the moment, we're emitting 37 billion tons every year. Scientists tell us you should not exceed 24 billion at the moment, because if you want to hit this 1.5 degrees, which I think we're not going to hit it really, we have 8 billion people. This means that every man, woman, and child on the planet has a ration of 3 tons per year. It became very simple. Americans, they do 15 tons per person a year. Okay. How many people in America? 400 million people. Multiply, what's the difference between 15 and 3 is 12. An elementary school, a child can do the sums. Multiply the price, this is the money goes into a trust run by the World Bank. Uganda does half. Okay, we owe 2.5 tons. Multiply by the population of Uganda, Mr. Museveni have this money, keep doing well, and sort out your transition. Build your resilience. That solves the whole problem. Yeah. We need to maintain the Amazon. Who pays? We need to maintain the Congo Basin. Yeah. Who pays for that? Should the Congolese pay for that? Should the Brazilian pay for that? Yeah. It is a public good. Everybody should pay for it. And that is the way to pay for it. Yeah. But it's so simple, so easy, but people turn their back in it because, oh, no, this is market economy. Excuse me, you invented market economy. Anyway, so I'll stop here. Yeah.
But James, can I just agree with him 1 second on this one particular point?
Noted. A very short agreement because yes. We do want to get the Honourable Prime Minister.
This is where we need climate investment leadership. We need the heads of state to come together with the largest pools of capital to work through these issues, because ultimately these are indicators and definers of what the preconditions and the entry conditions are to markets. And we're not having that conversation now. We're actually having the conversation with the institutions that are competing and like the status quo. So I think until we can get there, we can't deal with the credit rating agency, we can't rebuild the trust that we actually need on the carbon markets and those issues. And that's why we're calling for climate investment statesmanship and a very clear plan that can talk to investors and that governments can put in place the right conditions so that we can create the future that we need, because it certainly isn't what we have today.
So 3 things I took away from there. We need to understand the role of risk, better understand it. There was a link to data and the fact that we're just pricing risk very differently for different places. But I think more centrally that we can't be in favor of the market for the emitting parts of our economy, and then against the market in terms of simple market mechanisms for actually managing the emissions. And we may want to push those ideas. And all of that grounded in that vision that began to emerge here of lots of not just alternatives, but big benefits that Africa can bring to the world if it does receive this investment. I do want to turn to you, Prime Minister Gervais Ndirakobuka, to offer your perspective, having heard this conversation, sitting in Burundi. We heard a little bit around Mozambique's approach to this, and you've had a chance to hear the tenor of the conversation. We would appreciate your reflections as a head of state wrestling with these issues today, or head of government.
Merci beaucoup pour la parole. J'ai pas préparé pour.
Thank you very much.
Mais je suis d'accord avec la.
I didn't draft a speech exactly, but I do agree with the previous speakers, and they've said it all, really.
Dire que l'Afrique va se développer.
Africa
Financement du secteur privé.
will grow
Là aussi, ça reste problématique.
if it gets funds from the private sector, but that's a problem into itself.
Je viens de la table ronde
I just attended a roundtable
qui parle qu'ils ont
attended by the private sector, and the private sector talks about the headwinds they're experiencing. They're having a hard time investing in developing countries.
des réseaux. La première réseau, c'est
They discuss a number of reasons.
de la volonté politique.
First of all, a lack of political will among developing countries. And secondly, second reason behind those difficulties,
Entre le secteur privé
collaboration between the private sector and the public sector is poor. So those are the challenges that the private sector says they are faced with.
Vous avez parlé de nos
A number of issues
financiers.
have
Là aussi, il y a
been
des difficultés.
discussed, particularly when it comes to partnerships with financial institutions.
Entendre les discours d'ouverture sur les montants qui étaient alloués aux pays du monde et les montants qui ont été
We need to look at the amounts assigned to the different countries across the world and compare
là aussi c'est
those amounts earmarked around the world with the amounts
la plupart des
assigned to African countries.
pays sont en voie de développement.
We need to understand that most African countries are developing countries. Therein lies the rub.
Je pense que tout ce qui se fait, on a
We are still developing countries and we are not receiving as much funds as
J'ajoute
other non-developing countries across the world.
le problème de tirage
Now, special drawing rights.
qui ne respecte pas les moyens des pays.
There's a lack of regard for the resources available to the different countries.
Les nécessités ce ne sont pas les mieux servis.
Yes, drawing rights are being implemented,
Mais je pense que notre continent a des
but things could be done better. I do believe that our continent has
le problème.
excellent resources and a lot of potential, but financing must be modernized.
Mettre au développement ces ressources
Only then can Africa as a continent truly develop its resources.
au nouveau pacte financier mondial.
Now, the new global
Je
pact,
pense qu'avec les
is key.
discours que nous avons entendus ce matin,
we've heard a number of speakers this
le
morning,
nouveau pacte financier mondial va tenir compte
and on that
des
basis,
besoins des États.
I do want to believe that the new global pact will take into account the financing needs of
Et nous, Africains,
developing countries.
Mais je salue
It's not enough to just look at the interests and priorities of developed countries
de son Excellence le Président
while leaving developing countries of Africa by the wayside.
du pacte financier mondial. Et j'ose espérer que
So I salute the new
à
global pact.
partir de ce sommet, qu'il y aura des solutions.
And I hope that this summit will help us achieve new solutions so that Africa too
Pour pouvoir se développer, je vous remercie.
can receive the solutions that it needs in order for it to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Ndirakobuka. We have a few more minutes. I know that we started a little bit late. I think we have about 15 minutes to kind of open up the conversation a bit if there are additional comments or reflections from, I won't call it an audience because this is a round table, from other participants in the room. I will recognize the 1 and 2, and then we'll take another batch.
Thank you very much for that. My name is Chidi Oti Obihara. My background is in climate finance research, but before that I ran a desk at Morgan Stanley and was actually involved in actual finance. And so just to be clear about many of the really prescient statements I've heard just now, that there's a lot that has to be said about the difference between the finance markets, or the financial markets that lend and borrow money, and the commodities that sit below them. And we mustn't confuse the two of them. Although one set does help the other, governments have to act in a certain way in order to create the incentive for markets to match each other properly. And I wanted to draw everyone's attention to a recent group called the Rainforest Alliance, which was called by Lula out of Brazil. He invited the Congolese, and I believe he invited the Indonesians to join. Now, the potential for a global rainforest alliance is extremely important because it shows us what this new biodiversity credit, this new commodity, can do for certain types of markets. Think of OPEC in the 1970s. If we're entering into a world where it's very, very obvious that biodiversity credits and or the public goods that are provided by those rainforests around the world are essential to everyone else. They have to be paid for, and you, frankly, don't have to worry about who pays for it, but you have to factor in the fact that it has to be paid for. What we need is supply-side reform. We need African countries and private entities within Africa to gather together and form bargaining groups for assets that Africa owns virtual Southern Hemisphere monopolies on. You cannot own 65% of the world's global rainforests and sit at a table asking why you're not being paid, biodiversity credits. You own the market. But the only way you'll be known to own the market is if you all speak with one voice at one table as a supply side that is powerful. I say this again because I want to remind you all of what's been done already, what's already been achieved, is that despite the way that the post-colonial global economic system works, OPEC in the 1970s gathered together and changed the world's energy markets simply because they were able to coordinate supply. Now, this ability to coordinate supply, to gather together, make your price, make markets more efficient, is extremely important. Because, of course, it applies to biodiversity credits, but it applies to every other commodity where the African continent in general owns near monopoly supplies for its region. So the one bit of advice I wanted to give, and I'm reachable, I wear several hats, there are lots of organizations involved, I'm reachable to talk about this later on. The one bit of advice I wanted to deliver was that I think there is a horizon that we're heading for that many people don't yet see. But it's a very powerful horizon because we're entering into a new phase where Africans are connected. 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, we didn't have the internet. A little kid in Senegal couldn't talk to another little kid in Cape Town in 5 minutes because they found each other on Facebook and could chat. The world has changed. Our people talk to each other, but our governments don't do so enough. We need to start doing so and recognizing the power we already have. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Great, thanks everyone. I'm Kathy, part of the Fearless Women group of the B team that last spring we came together. There are 40, 50 of amazing women leaders and civil society, including civil society leaders, that came together and brainstormed the Europe's Energy Earthshot, and which had a dozen of thematic groups, and which one witnessed the birth of this Africa-Europe alliance. So so honored and so proud to see all the progress that has been made in the past year, and also shout out to Jamila and everyone from B Team. I know Mo just left, but everyone from B Team for putting all the efforts in, and for all the, and also great to see many friends across the room for showing interest in this collaboration. And I guess one reflection from me, and I guess one hope from me, is going forward, there's so many key moments this year, including the Africa Climate Summit, the SG Ambition Summit, and of course COP28. And I think it would be really lovely to see, how our alliance can bring in more young people, more women that are disproportionately affected, and especially local communities and indigenous peoples that are disproportionately affected by the crisis into this collaboration and how we really empower them and support them going forward. And just want to say thanks again to everyone.
Thank you. I'll take maybe one more comment from the floor. Mark?
Thank you, James. It's brilliant to see this unity around this idea of, Hubert, to use your phrase, the climate investment statesmanship. I think that's a really good phrase to use. And there's the whole idea of drawing on private capital, international private capital, to solve the issues and to capture the opportunities, I think, that exist in Africa. So I want to say thank you for that. But I just wanted to ask whether panelists, speakers would consider it a failure of this summit if there were, in fact, a massive increase in funding to the World Bank, and or not, because that is one of the options that's out there.
Mark, I may have this. Okay, great. So what I will do now is, in closing and beginning with you, Honourable Prime Minister, unless you would like to have the last word, kind of.
You ask the last word when you're dying.
And I don't want the last word.
I will take the moderator's obligation and have the last word, but I'll invite the Prime Minister, and then in the order of our speakers, to maybe offer a final reflection as we bring the session to a close.
Thank you very much, moderator. I was, hearing carefully to understand the challenges we have. It's like on financing. It's like someone who say, we have to borrow without sorrow. Meaning that the big problem is you want money, but at the same time you regret after getting that money because the conditions are very, 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 very difficult. But also, we understood in Mozambique that relying on credit, you have no way to go. So this is why we define this energy as one element or one component that makes things happen. And we saw that putting in the very rural area electricity, the power, you see a lot of activities coming up. So what we did is to create an enabling environment to get investors. And investors are coming in Mozambique. We're investing in this renewable energy. It's private sector, not government. And now we have almost 100 solar, which is something that, although we have hydro, but we think that we have to move for that issue. And I was listening carefully the role of rating agent. I understand that when the issue is about Africa, people they try to rate us, but some of them they never be there. Just rating based on their perception. Everything coming from Africa should not be good. But I must tell you, the good payer is African, because we continue to have our world value. So those willing to invest in Africa, they will come, because when we borrow money, we pay. We're paying. So I think that is very important. I agree with you that we have to have a pool instead of having different institutions with a budget. I mean, but budgets, it's a very poor budget, but at the same time, huge demand. So I think that we have to use these as, who knows, maybe we will have a very special summit to deal with this issue. But in Mozambique, we think that energy, and also why we are defending this transition period, because they are civil societies and they are complain about the fossil energy like coal, but we already have that. We invite investors in those areas. They are investing because we said to them that we need energy. So if you have no transition period, it can be seen as you cheated investors. You invite investors, they put their money, and then you change everything overnight. So this period of transition is very important. Also, finally, we think that in case of Mozambique, because geographically we are well located and well endowed in terms of energy, we think that we can help our neighbor to move to renewed energy using this pool of funding to facilitate this transition. So this is why all time we say, okay, we have to move to new, clean, but we have to take into account that we have a compromise that you have to be solved. So thank you very much. It was for me a good opportunity to share and listen, especially to listen their other experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister Maliane. I think with an eye on time, what I will try and do is bring us to a close. First of all, bringing us back to the question that stands before us, which is this huge opportunity that we understand in different ways around the future of energy and the future of green industrialization that Africa has. The need for new investment instruments, the need to think carefully about the assets we've already committed to and how we manage a transition fairly and sustainably, but briskly. And the need, importantly, to recognize that we're talking to a global private sector who also needs to think a bit differently about this challenge and how they think about things like risk and so on. But I think we always need to come back, because I think for too long and too often when we meet to discuss anything in Africa, we talk about the challenges and the problems. I think some of the points that we are all recognizing, which is the huge resources, be they biodiversity, be they our ability to manage, to manage climate assets like our carbon sinks, be they our huge renewable energy potential. All of these are resources that can be used for the benefit of Africa and for the world. And I think it's all for us to play for in terms of unlocking them using the new financing ideas being discussed today and hopefully onwards. Prime Ministers Ndirakobuka and Maliane, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. I would like to really thank all of our panelists for their fantastic inputs and some of the other inputs that we've received from the floor. And with that, we'll close this session and wish you all a good remainder of your summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.